Greetings and welcome back to room 303 and our talks with Walt, as we are calling all of our readings through the major poems, all of the poems of the deathbed edition of Whitman's Leaves of Grass. We turn now to Song of Myself, passage number 31. We're going to meet now Whitman as a Darwinian, or Whitman as evolutionist, however you wish to think of it. Now, we've already said in earlier lectures that in section 26 to 38, we're looking at the poet's microscopic vision moving from the ordinary to the mystical. And especially in sections 31 through 33, we've got this cataloging of really infinite wonders as it relates to the small things. Now, we have said already in earlier lectures that really the key line comes from passage 4, both of Song of Myself, both in and out of the game, and watching and wondering at it, I witness and wait. Now, my assumption is that you've been with us at learnstrong.net, the Inscriptions 24 poems. We're even going to reference one of those here early on, starting from Pomenac passages 1 through 19, and of course Song of Myself, from our intro lecture, and I hope at least you've watched that one, through, we've already now done through lecture number 30 of section 30, right? Now, we're going to learn what Whitman thinks it's like to live in or inhabit an evolved body. Now, I hope that you will remember back in our inscription section that we messed around with this little poem called For Him I Sing. For Him I Sing, I raise the present on the past, as some perennial tree out of its roots, the present on the past. With time and space I him dilate and fuse the immortal laws, to make himself by them the law unto himself. Now let's turn to passage number 31. Now we referenced the first line of this in our concluding comments of passage 30. I believe. Okay, now I believe the soggy clause is the way he said it in 30. Now let's go ahead and enjoy passage 31. I believe a leaf of grass is no less than the journey work of the stars. And the pismire is equally perfect, and a grain of sand, and the egg of the wren, and the tree toad is a chef d'oeuvre for the highest, and the running blackberry would adorn the parlors of heaven, and the narrowest hinge in my hand puts to scorn all machinery, and the cow crunching with depressed head surpasses any statue, and a mouse is miracle enough to stagger 6 tillions of infidels. I find I incorporate nice, coal, long-threaded moss, fruits, grains, esculent roots, and am stuccoed with quadrupeds and birds all over, and have distanced what is behind me for good reasons, but call anything back again when I desire it. In vain the speeding or shyness. In vain the plutonic rocks send their old heat against my approach. In vain the mastodon retreats beneath its own powdered bones. In vain objects stand leagues off and assume manifold shapes. In vain the ocean settling in hollows and the great monsters lying low. In vain the buzzard houses herself with the sky. In vain the snake slides through the creepers and logs. In vain the elk takes to the inner passes of the woods. In vain the razored-bill ox sails far north to Labrador. I follow quickly, I ascend to the nest in the fissure of the cliff. Now, we should point out right away, notice in that final line, that we're going to play around with the word ascend, and that's going to be one of the key words, of course, in evolutionary thought. Now, let's go back to work right away, and notice we have 2 sets of different, let's say this now quickly at 2b. Notice we have 2 sets of this anaphoria gig happening, right? That is to say, we've got a number 6 of them in a row, the word and we will have 9 of the in vain. So we're playing that anaphoria game where the same words will begin in terms of a new line. We'll pay attention to it as we go. Notice he begins. Here's what he believes. He says, I believe a leaf of grass. Now, do you remember Passage 1 of Song of Myself. I celebrate myself and sing myself, and what I assume you shall assume, for every atom belonging to me as good belongs to you. I loaf and invite my soul. I lean and loaf at my ease, observing a spear of summer grass. Here, notice we're back to the title of the poem itself. I believe a leaf of grass is no less than the journey work of the stars. Now, of course, here we're going to be messing around with astronomy. We're going to be messing around with science all the way through, through this passage. He then comments on the pismire. The ant is equally perfect, and a grain of sand. Now here, obviously, we got to remember our Blake, right? To see a world in a grain of sand, and heaven in a world of flower. To hold infinity in the palm of your hand, and eternity in an hour, the famous Blake line. Here, notice he says, everything can be subsumed in the most simplest of things. An ant, a grain of sand, the egg of the wren. Of course, we're going to have birds that begin and will end this. By the way, can I point this out for your notes? I know that you're working with me. You have your own copy, the deathbed edition of Leaves of Grass, and you're annotating it. Can I make a suggestion? Every time there has been any mention of animals in Leaves of Grass, just point it out so that by the time you finish reading Leaves of Grass, just note how many different animals Whitman will play around with. And of course, we have the penultimate example of this coming in his I Think I Could Turn and Live with the Animals passage that will be 32, that will follow our discussion here, right? Notice he goes to the tree toad, and he says it's a chef d'oeuvre for the highest. In other words, the seemingly most insignificant of life form is going to be significant. Think about Thoreau's Walden as we're playing this game. And the running blackberry. Notice your adjectives and your verbs, by the way, in this passage. The running blackberry would adorn the parlors of heaven. It's a wonderful way to say it, right? In other words, you only need the simplest of things. Thoreau says the same thing in Walden. We've given full lectures, of course, on Walden elsewhere at learnstrong.net, but Thoreau said the same thing. All you need are the simplest things in life. You don't need a lot of extravagance. And the narrowest, now this is an interesting one, and the narrowest hinge in my hand puts to scorn all machinery. Now, of course, in passage 48, he will say, to glance with an eye or show a bean in its pod confounds the learning of all time. In other words, the human body is so unbelievable and complex that it puts to shame all of the major machinery that one can have. And of course today, as we're now beginning to invest time, energy, and possibilities in artificial intelligence, we continue to marvel at just what the human mind can in fact do. And of course, will computers ever be able to simulate it entirely? It's obviously a question that we'll continue to debate. Notice here we have the cow crunching with depressed head, surpasses any statue. In other words, the highest art form cannot even come close to a cow in a field. And a mouse, we have to think about Burns as to a mouse, right? And a mouse is miracle enough to stagger 6 of infidels. Now, of course, this thing about trying to convince the unbeliever or somebody who's not quite coming along for the ride, that's an echo that you know you've heard before already in your study of Leaves of Grass. And of course, you're going to hear it far more times as well. And then, interestingly, we have a missing line that I'm gonna play around with you now. That's quite fascinating. So let's take a look at that one. The missing line now that will follow this line. And again, with these missing lines, I like to point them out to you because you get to decide, like, why exactly he plays this game. He says it this way: "And I could come every afternoon of my life to look at the farmer's girl boiling her iron tea kettle and baking shortcake." Now, it's not a line that ends up in the deathbed edition version of this poem. It's one that was edited out from the 55 version. I'll leave it to you to consider whether that's a legitimate one or not. He continues next, "And I find an incorporate nice, coal, long-threaded moss." We obviously have heard about pokeweed from passage 5. "Fruits, grains, esculent roots." Now I want to pause for a moment here, and I want to turn to our Nortons, and we'll read a note that will be of some significance, because these lines will in fact correlate with Walt Whitman's notebook observation. Quote, this is what Whitman wrote: "The soul or spirit transmits itself into all matter, into rocks, and can live the life of rock, into the sea, and can feel itself the sea, into the oak or other tree, into an animal, and we feel itself a horse, a fish, a bird, into the earth, into the motions of the suns and stars, end quote. And then Norton continues, the passage as a whole reflects the concepts of the evolution of species popularized by Darwin's Origin of Species 4 years later. I mean, consider now the fact that we are talking about the original version of this poem is 1855, Darwin's Origin of Species, 1859. Notice as well these escalant roots. We're going to hear that very phrase, write it down at 3a, and there was a child went forth. And as well, we just read it from the poem, For Him I Sing, the idea, you'll remember, of the roots, okay? And of course, if you're talking about leaves of grass, just go back and look at all the times that notions of sprouting and rooting will be a part of leaves of grass. And he continues, I'm stuccoed, that is to say, I am surrounded, we might say, with quadrupeds and birds all over. Now, of course, we pointed out, we've got two of them mentioned here with the wren and the auk. We got birds all the way through leaves of grass. It's one of the powerful symbols, we will say, of course, of leaves of grass. And he says, I have distanced what is behind me for good reasons, transcend and include, always moving forward, right? But call anything back again when I desire it. In other words, it's a fascinating idea. We carry with us all of the implications of the evolutionary process. Everything that's ever come from before is somehow a part. And you'll remember, we said it at 3a already in Tennyson's Ulysses, I'm a part of all that I have met. Now we're going to play around with this in vain, in vain, in vain. Now hey, let's make sure we understand. This is not the vein in your arm, right? This is vain as in attempting something that maybe is useless. Here what he means is, put it in your nose, he means in some ways beyond. In other words, it is beyond. Whatever he's trying to capture, it is beyond, okay? Notice we got a listing. We got 9 of these now, these cataloging that will happen. In vain, the speeding or shyness. Notice the repetition of the S. In vain, the plutonic rocks send their old heat against my approach. Again, the Norton's note here will tell us plutonic rocks solidified from the molten conglomerate deep in the earth here associated with the earliest Archeozoic earth history. In other words, Whitman is very interested in going very back to the very beginnings. And he says, all the way back to the very, very start, the old heat against my approach. Of course, as we pointed out, this approach that he's talking about is an approach that he can come back to anytime he desires it, right? In vain, the mastodon, the large animals, right, that lived in prehistory, retreats beneath its powdered bones. What a great way to talk about the way the mastodon lives on through its powdered bones. In vain, objects stand, we've seen the word stand, haven't we? Leagues off and assume manifold shapes. In vain, the ocean settling in hollows. Notice all your verbs here that are quite remarkable. And the great monsters lying low. Obviously, we're going to hear a lot in Leaves of Grass about different kinds of monsters. In vain, the buzzard houses herself with the sky. The sky and the buzzard are all somehow synonymous for Whitman. In vain, the snake slides, it's a wonderful verb, slides through the creepers and logs. We think, of course, of Thoreau and Walt. In vain, the elk takes to the inner passes of the woods. We know a thing or two, of course, about elk living where we live. In vain, the razor-billed auk, this is this strange-looking bird, sails far north to Labrador. I follow quickly. I ascend to the nest in the fissure of the cliff, the rock face, right? Think about how that fissure of the cliff has echoes with biblical language as well. Of course, Psalm 61:2, lead me to the rock, of course, as well as Song of Solomon passage, chapter 2, verse 14, and of course, the passing of God in front of Moses in Exodus 33:22 through 23. I just want to point out the ways in which Darwin's always playing around with biblical language, it seems, and here he will make those echoes as well possible for us. Well, notice with the word ascend, we're playing around, obviously, with the idea of Darwinian evolutionary views. So let's go ahead and finish now quickly at 2A. Well, what is the major message here of a poem like this? Well, we're all connected. Everything's connected. Somehow, we're all connected with everything that has come from before, and of course, everything that will go into the future. Okay? The power, in other words, of an evolutionary model. At 2B, well, we mentioned the anaphoria. Notice how this works, that kind of in vain, all right, repetition. At 3A, well, we should point out all of the cataloging is happening in Leaves of Grass, all of the echoing, as we have said it before. Now, we've had this kind of cataloging already. You'll go back and you'll go, oh yeah, I remember where I've heard and seen this kind of cataloging. Obviously, it's setting us up for more of it to come, especially in the great cataloging section of 33. Darwin's Origin of Species, for sure, right down at 3A. That one, again, we said is 1859, so 4 years after he publishes this poem for the first time, Darwin will instantiate this idea of the origin of species, the survival of the species through natural selection. And as well, Darwin's Descent of Man in 1871, right? And both of these are going to be incredibly influential in Whitman's thinking. By the way, we've given lectures on Darwin at learnstrong.net. I'll let you go and find those lectures on your own. We've mentioned Thoreau's Walden. We should mention Emerson's essay, Nature. And as well, I'd like us to put here Emily Dickinson's personification of nature and her own fascination with the idea of the cyclical nature of nature. Finally, at 3B, just to finish, does it give you any comfort to know that we are all in some ways connected? Somehow we all kind of find ways to be a part of everything that came before and everything that's going to follow. Is there some solace that you take in that idea at all? Well, speaking of connected, let's now move on to passage 32, and let's talk about animals. And of course, we've seen animals, but now we're really going to enjoy Whitman's view of your dog or your cat or your favorite animal. Thank you.